Certainly.
Awesome. Well, I am so excited to virtually welcome you from an epically snowy morning in the Twin Cities. Oh, am I supposed to be letting Josh? Sorry.
No worries. Um, I'm just going to give a brief introduction. Hello. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending this session right over here on silviculture and agroforestry. My name is Josh. I am a senior here at WashU. I'm very interested in agroforestry, so very excited to be listening, just as you guys are. We're going to be having two presentations filling this time here. If you're joining us on Zoom, feel free to put any questions in the chat throughout as they come up. And then towards the end, we're going to be doing a brief question and answer where we can get you guys going. And without further ado, here we go.
Okay, take two. Welcome and good morning. And I am so excited to just introduce this wonderful group of speakers that is going to be talking about adaptive silviculture. I'm Marcella Wimmuller-Campioni. Abby Daniel, Drew Harmon, Emma Vandy, and Karen Salas are here in person. And this is just a wonderful, collaborative, large-scale project. Next slide. Awesome. So this individual project, this individual experiment that you're going to get to hear a lot more about, brings together so many different organizations, from federal to state to private to nonprofit to academic, and just spans the range of individuals, volunteers, organization groups, and I am very grateful. We are very grateful that this project has allowed us to all come together to work on a big thing in our region: climate change in urban floodplain forests. Next slide. And so maybe this is the first time you're hearing silviculture, which is the art and science of how forests are managed based on goals and values. It's a discipline that has, from a Western science lens, over 100+ years of science and theory that goes with it, as well as this acknowledgement of the art in that every ecosystem is unique, and that we humbly come to each ecosystems as we consider when we manage or not manage them. Next slide. And so the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change Network is this huge network that spans across North America with the intent of doing on-the-ground research that brings together scientists and managers to think about real-world climate change examples. So how do we implement climate change solutions in forest management on the ground in large-scale experiments? And so we are the first urban adaptive climate change project at Crosby Farms, Minnesota. Next slide. And so this big problem, folks probably have been talking about this not only the last few days here, but like continually as we think about how we meet the changing climate as forests change, as our ecosystems change, as all these things change. And so the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change Network tries to consider different methods, different ways, and we're going to go through that kind of resistance, resilience, transition framework and hear about that within our study site, and kind of also think about how these results relate to many ecosystems in the Great Lakes region. Next slide, and I think I'm turning it over to Abby now.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. I'm Abby Daniel. I'm a grad student at the University of Minnesota. I'm very grateful to be a part of this very unique project. So our specific Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change, or ASK project, takes place in Crosby Farm Regional Park. So this is located in St. Paul, Minnesota, along the Mississippi River. You can see that it's a large natural area. It's the largest natural park within the St. Paul Park system, and it's located between two highly urbanized areas, which makes it a very important resource for people within St. Paul. And so Crosby Farm is primarily a floodplain forest. So I'll do a little bit of background on that. For those of you who were at the flooding workshop yesterday, you probably learned a little bit about this unique forest ecosystem. So these forests exist along major river bottoms, and they're a part of a unique system of channels and lakes and backlands and wetlands that form the unique riverine system. And so these forests are adapted to seasonal flooding. So they're driven by this, inundation of water, which influences a lot of wildlife in the area. It's important wildlife habitat. It's also part of different life cycles for various fish. And as I think was mentioned previously at the flooding workshop, this is an incredibly important habitat for migratory birds. Some of y'all may know about a bald eagle. They really like nesting in the overstory trees within the floodplain forest. These forests are also incredibly important in nutrient cycling during the flooding pulse, and as well as nitrogen, absorbing nitrogen so that it less input down along the river and out into the Gulf of Mexico. So they help with that, reducing nitrogen input into the apoxia situation down at the Gulf of Mexico. Currently, a lot of floodplain forests are struggling with natural regeneration, which has a bunch of contributing factors to that, including invasive or displaced species, which have changed a lot of the ecosystem. One in particular is the emerald ash borer, this little green guy. That has come through Crosby Farm and virtually eliminated the green ash tree population, which has left a lot of standing dead trees, gaps in the canopy, and that has contributed to the invasive plant species coming in, like cucumber vine and buckthorn and reed canary grass, which has also contributed to a lot of changes within this ecosystem. And our plots for the Ask project were strategically placed where emerald ash borer has come in. So part of the Ask project is also looking at a diverse range of tree species to help maintain a diverse floodplain forest, since emerald ash borer has come in and changed so much. And of course, the reason why we're all here, climate change, the floodplain forests are projected to be impacted by climate change factors. This includes higher average temperatures in the lower half of Minnesota, increased precipitation, which can lead to increased and severe flooding events, which can influence the forest since they're used to a more seasonal, regular flooding events. And the climate of the lower half of Minnesota, where Crosby Farm is projected to look similar to that of Omaha, Nebraska, I think, at the end of the century. So there's a lot of changes happening within the floodplain forest. And this is, why we're here and working together to try to figure out how to support these forests through these really big changes. And so I'll pass it off to the partnerships that have formed and a little bit more background information on that as well.
Hi, I'm Karen Solis. I'm the Stewardship Director with Mississippi Park Connection, and we are the nonprofit partner to the National Park Service in the Twin Cities. We were established in 2007. Our main goal is to create opportunities for people to connect to the river and kind of build those connections, nourish those connections. And we do that through youth education, environmental stewardship, and community engagement. We're also the fundraising partner for the park, and we co-manage the volunteer programming and public programs. Most people, a lot of people who live right in the Twin Cities don't know that we have a national park right there. It's kind of a strange national park. It's not what you normally think of with like an entrance gate that you go through and then you're in the national park. Our park is actually a collection of many parks. So to just kind of back us up a little bit to orient you, you can see Minnesota on the map there, or I guess, sorry, you're looking that way. I'm pointing over there. We have the headwaters of the Mississippi River, which is in that little question mark area. And then the river stretches down, goes right through Minneapolis and St. Paul. And in our metro area, there are a lot of remarkable geological features to the river and a lot of historic and cultural significance. And so that map on the right side of the screen is the section of that is the national park. Our park is called the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area, which might also be part of its problem, is that it doesn't have a name that really rolls off your tongue. But it is a 72-mile stretch of the river that, like I said, goes right through the heart of Minneapolis and St. Paul. The park was established in 1988. And of its 54,000 acres, only about 64 are owned and managed by the National Park Service, which is an unusual, model for a national park. The rest of the park is made up of city, county, state parks, and other conservation districts. It's a collection of parks, and the national park is almost like the wrapping paper that brings it all together. Where we live and work in the Twin Cities metro area of Minnesota are the ancestral homelands of the Dakota people. The Dakota have a long and rich history of caring for the land and the river, and they're still there caring for the land and teaching all of us how to be better stewards of the land. The name Minnesota is derived from a Dakota phrase, Minnesota Makoche, which means land where the waters reflect the clouds. And this map shows gives some of the Dakota names for our important places, but it also shows a really important location right next to Crosby Park, which is the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers. That's one of the most historically significant landscapes in our state, and it's known to many Dakota people as Bedote. The Dakota people called the Mississippi River Wakpatanka, which was the Great River, or Haha Wakpa, which means River of the Falls. And you can see that circled area is where it comes together with the Minnesota River, Wakpa, Minnesota. Bedote means where two waters come together. And many Dakota people consider this location as a sacred place of creation. It's one of the most widely held creation stories is that their people came down on the Spirit Road, which is the Milky Way made up of the stars. And when they got to Earth, they were carved, they were molded out of clay by the creator right here at Bedote. So as you can see on this map, Crosby, where that purple arrow is, Crosby Farm Regional Park is right next to Bedote. You can see it from the riverbanks. And it's essential that we keep this deep cultural significance in mind in the work that we do at the park and in engaging our Indigenous partners. And so you're going to hear one example of how we're doing that later on in the presentation. So then moving on through the history of the park, after the land was stolen from the Dakota people and they were forcibly removed, the area was colonized by white settlers. Thomas Crosby obtained the original 160-acre farm in 1858 and farmed it until his death in 1886. It was the largest and longest running farm in the area, and he had cattle, cows, pigs, horses, and he also farmed things like potatoes and apples. So that photo on the left is an aerial photo of what it looked like when it was a farm. It continued to be farmed after his death by other families until the early 1960s, which was, fairly recently. And then it was obtained by the St. Paul Port Authority and then leased to the city as a park. It's, as Abby mentioned, I think it's the largest natural park in the St. Paul system of parks, and it's a really important component in a string of parks that protects this biodiversity of the Mississippi River corridor through the Twin Cities. Sorry.
All right, back to me. So now we'll kind of get into what Ask is and the setup of the project. So here in the white circle, you can see a bunch of little blue circles, which are an aerial image of the plots that we have that consist of the Ask treatments within Crosby Farm. And so this whole project was designed with a bunch of partnerships and collaborators from scientists and land managers who came together to design this specific project for the floodplain forest in 2019. So we had US, federal, Minnesota state, tribal land managers all come together to figure out what tree species and what setup would work best for our forest. And so the Ask project is set up to test a spectrum of treatments on how to best prepare and support our forests through climate change. So this spectrum goes from resistance, which is maintaining the current forest conditions as they are right now, through improving the defenses of the forest against change and disturbances like flooding and drought stress. And so this is to try to maintain relatively unchanged conditions within the ecosystem. And so moving along that spectrum of change, resilience is incorporating some degree of change within the forest ecosystem. So incorporating species that maybe are a bit more adapted to, adapted to flooding and drought stress. But this is with the idea to return the forest to prior conditions following disturbance. And then our transition plots, we are fully and intentionally promoting change within the ecosystem. So incorporating trees that are more adapted to the projected warming climate. And so this is facilitating that change within the ecosystem and helping the ecosystem to adapt to new and changing conditions. And so the more logistical side of the study design, we had those 3 zones of where all our plots are located. We have 24 plots total, 6 plots per treatment. We also have a control treatment where we're just allowing the forest to do its thing without any active management strategies. So our plots are a circle that are 1/10 of an acre in size with 57 trees planted, randomly planted in a 10 by 10 grid. And it's surrounded by fence to protect from herbivory. And so the species that were selected correspond to these different USDA plant hardiness zones, which you can see on the left. And so one caveat is that this map has not been updated since 2012. So we're likely already seeing a shift in those zones northward. So zone 5 probably is even more north into Minnesota. So our central and southern half of Minnesota is zone 4. So our resistance species that were specifically selected for this zone come from nurseries in this zone. They are native trees to this region, including silver maple, American elm, and this is a Dutch elm disease resistant elm tree, as well as cottonwood and river birch and hackberry. And these trees are also underrepresented in the native regeneration. So we're trying to promote that diversity better. And so our resilience trees correspond to nurseries from plant hardiness zone 5, so farther south. So we still have those local species, but their seed sources are from farther south. So these seeds come from areas that are currently a bit warmer and more used to that drought stress and the changes that are projected to happen up north here in South Minnesota. And then we also have one species in bold in the box, the American sycamore. So this is incorporating that degree of change. So this is a species that is not native or does not currently, is not local to our floodplain forests in South Minnesota, but it still exists along floodplains farther south. And then in our transition plots, we are actively bringing up more non-local species that are further adapted to these projected climate changes. So this is assisted species migration, where we are bringing up these species that are more adapted to the zone 6 climate, and as well as the species that we're familiar with, like silver maple and river birch, and their seed sources are from zone 6. And then you can see that we also have silver maple from zone 4 in all of the plots as a control species. And so we'll kind of get into the process of creating these plots at Crosby and all the different people who helped out with that. So we created gaps in the forest, strategically located where emerald ash borer has come in and eliminated that overstory canopy, and as well as the other plants in that area. So we'll kind of get into more on that.
Hi, my name is Emma Bondi, and I'm the volunteer coordinator for Mississippi Park Connection. And because Crosby Farm is located in an urban setting and receives a lot of foot traffic, this is a great way for volunteers and the public to be involved. And since 2020, 1,240 volunteers have contributed 3,470 hours to our project. And it all started in May of 2020. And to say the least, this was a very tough time with the rise of COVID-19, the National Park Service placing federal restrictions on volunteers, and George Floyd's murder. There was a lot of tension in this area. And in the span of 2 weeks, for every single day, for 2 to 3 sessions each day, groups of 10 volunteers and staff masked up, socially distanced, and planted 1,200 trees and built 24 circular deer plots for the Ask project. And because we were discouraging groups from being together in long periods of time, staff meticulously labeled and flagged every single tree to their assigned planting spot to guide volunteers on what tree needed to be planted where. But volunteers do not only stop at creating these plots, and we also use them with collecting data, such as our phenology data, which is the study of plant life stages and their recurring life cycles and their responses to the environment. And after they receive training from us, they go to their marked trees in their assigned plots and they check for status and intensity of each tree. And they're checking for breaking leaf buds, unfolding leaves, full leaf size, colored leaves, and falling leaves as a way to show what trees are adapting to Minnesota's climate. Additionally, we also have volunteers take photos of our plots as a way to better demonstrate the changes and trends that we are seeing in Minnesota. And so we can see from the standardized vantage point on the left-hand side, they take a picture through that vantage point to show what the plot looks like. And you can see the month difference from April and May 2020 from the same plot. Lastly, as staff cannot be outside every day, we have independent monitors that check on our plots. And so they're checking for any deadfall, such as the fallen ash tree that fell on our plot here. They're also checking for loose fencing, any damages to the structure, such as the broken gate. And they're also seeing if our instruments are in good working condition. And while it is their responsibility to show us like what is happening in its plots, they're not responsible for fixing it. And so we either send our staff or we have our Crosby crew, which is our recurring group of volunteers that come out twice a month from March through November. And this is the easiest way for volunteers to be involved with the Ask project. As volunteers and groups of volunteers like corporate groups or Boy Scout, Girl Scout troops can sign up online on our website. And so they perform fence maintenance, they collect temperature data, which is what's happening on the right-hand side. They also remove any introduced species, amongst other needed tasks for the Ask project. And now I'll hand it off to Drew.
Hey everyone, my name is Drew Harmon. I started off with a project in November 2021 with the Silviculture lab through the University of Minnesota. And then through that, I got a student position as a biological science technician with the National Park Service. And they provided me funding to work full time. So I provided a lot of support to this project over the summer. And I still work part time, monitoring the plots, doing maintenance and things like phenology, like Emma talked about. So to reiterate a point, this is a massive park, the biggest in the city of St. Paul. And it gets 530,000 visitors per year as of 2017. And that's only expected to grow. They estimate 15% by 2040. So if we're talking about collaborations, one of the most important groups to collaborate is the public that is coming by and going through this extensive trail system. The trail system brings everyone right by the river, right by the lakes. People use it to fish, for walking, running, biking, and cross-country skiing in the winter. Another thing about these trails is they go right by the plots. So we have a lot of visitors walking by and seeing these plots and wondering, well, what's going on in here? Why is there a clearing? Why is there fencing? Why are there these little baby trees? So one way in which we engage with community is we offer tours of the plots to really any group that asks. This past fall, we took Nyax, one of our collaborators, on a tour. This picture is from a corporate group who volunteered and helped us do some displaced species removal. And then afterwards, we took them around to the plots and engaged them with the research that we're doing. Another really important way we engaged is actually with a partnership with the Lower Phelan Creek Project. The Lower Phelan Creek Project is an Indigenous Dakota-led organization, nonprofit conservation organization from the city of St. Paul. And the artist, Willard Mailbear, Dakota artist, designed the art for these signs, and each sign features a different tree that's planted in one of the different treatment plots. And the signs have the English translation for the species, as well as the Dakota translation, and for red maple has the Anishinaabe translation. These have been a huge success. We installed them in this past July. And underneath the artwork of the signs are informational signs with QR codes that you can scan, and it goes through each of the different treatments and what we're doing. And every time I've been to Crosby, since we've installed these signs, I've seen people engaging with them and looking at them and just appreciating the beautiful artwork. I just think they do a really great job of tying in the history of the park, as well as like ongoing and current conservation efforts, as well as really emphasizing all the different partnerships that make this a reality. So we do have more plans for the future of engaging with visitors that involve the volunteer program that Emma talked about. In the early 2022, there was an idea to have roving educational volunteers. So what this would entail is that we'd train volunteers to give interpretation on the plots to different visitors. We'd give them educational materials, and they'd just be able to sort of rove around the park and provide information when necessary. Unfortunately, just due to staffing shortages, this plan hit a little roadblock, but we're hoping to get it going as soon as possible.
All right, so with all of this background information on the setup of Ask and all the different people involved, how have the trees done so far? So this is also a 20-year project that got started in 2020. So we're on year 3 so far. So we have a long ways to go, but we've collected a lot of data on the tree survival and their growth, phenology. Part of my contribution to this project will be further analyzing that phenology data to see if there's any unique trends happening between tree species and the plots. But I'll go over a little bit of survival and growth. So these are our yearly survival percentages across the plots throughout the 3 years that they've been growing so far. And so you can see that we honestly have fairly high survival rates, which is really awesome, with resistance having the highest survival. So those trees that are native to the region, and transition plots having the lowest survival. So those trees that were from southerly locations. And so most of our mortality did occur in the first growing season, but since then it's kind of leveled out. And you can see in the transition plots, we did have a little increase in survival, but that's because we had what we call zombie trees. So trees that looked like they had died, but then they kind of came back to life the next year. So that's where that uniqueness comes from. And then to go over some growth, some examples from each of the plots of how much our trees have grown. This is their height between their first growing, when they first were planted in June 2020, to the end of their second growing season in 2021. You can see that silver maple has done really great, as well as river birch, and our disease-resistant American elm has done really good in the resistance plots. And then in our resilience, we again have silver maple from zone 4 and zone 5 putting on a lot of growth, as well as our sycamore tree putting on quite a bit of growth. And then in our transition plots, sycamore put on the most growth, and sycamore actually put on the most growth out of all the trees. And then silver maple from zone 4 and zone 5, as well as silver maple from zone 4 and zone 5 also put on the most growth. And again, you can kind of see this like difference in trend, tulip poplar decreasing in growth. And that was from some dieback. So overall, they've been doing pretty well. And I guess for a reference, some of the trees, especially silver maple, are probably like twice my height. I'm 5'3", so yeah, so you can kind of see that they're actually getting pretty big so far. So it'll be interesting to see how they are in 20 years, along with all of these projected changes that will continue, and stay tuned for how things continue to grow and to change with that.
So what are we going to do with all this information? Obviously, there are a lot of ways that we can share this information, but for us at Mississippi Park Connection and the National Park Service, being that our park is made up of all of these different little parks with all of these different land managers from cities and counties and park districts and state agencies, all of those folks are people that we support in their land management, in their ecological restoration and habitat management efforts. And they're all like waiting, and they just can't wait. They're asking us all the time, what are you learning? What are you learning? So we're really looking looking forward to this spring starting to share some of the information that we've learned from the first 3 years with them. They're all looking for best management practices, for the future, given these projected climate change conditions. What species should they be planting? What sort of management strategies will they need to care for those trees? And another part of it is our volunteer program. And so what are tasks that need to be done by your staff and crew, but what are things that could be done with a volunteer force? And what could that look like? What are the different possibilities, which is why we have all these different types of volunteer roles. And we're looking at the ways that that contributes to the project. So one big part of it is trying to come up with these best practices to share with the land managers that we work with in the park. And another part of it is that we're hoping to share with other national parks and try to get some of them on board to consider, maybe consider an ask project in your own national park. In Minnesota, we also have the St. Croix National River, Scenic Riverway. It also has an awesome name that's just rolls off your tongue. And that's right on the border, very close to us, right on the border of Minnesota and Wisconsin. We have Voyageurs National Park in northern Minnesota and Apostle Islands National Park in Wisconsin. And those are all parks that we think could learn a lot from their own respective ask projects. So that's another way that we hope to kind of share how this experience has worked for us. And I believe that is it. And we will take questions after the next presentation. So thank you.
Whatever you're more comfortable with. I'll stand to talk here. Hello. So how do we transition slides here? Is that something you can do, Josh? Maybe great. Thank you. So just to get rolling here, appreciate you being here. Thank you. I am Fred Utze. I'm Director of Research and Commercialization for the Savannah Institute. I'm joined virtually by a couple of my colleagues here, Nate Lawrence and Monica Shea. We're going to give the sort of the complementary systems talk here to what you've just heard about, applications of trees in agricultural systems, agroforestry here. So the Savannah Institute is an agroforestry focused nonprofit organization. We're based in southern Wisconsin and central Illinois, celebrating our 10th anniversary this year. But the three of us who are here to speak on-site or virtually are part of one of our newer program areas, our agroforestry research program here. And so what we're going to chat about, I'm going to say another word or two about agroforestry and where it fits in as a natural climate solution. And then my colleagues here will give a sort of one vignette about research to advance agroforestry as a climate adaptation solution and research we're planning to advance it as a mitigation solution here. So, for those who aren't familiar, agroforestry, our ED likes to put it that it's growing trees with other crops on purpose. Sometimes that happens accidentally and is sort of a plant out of place. We're talking about doing it on purpose in a well-designed, ecologically designed manner that maximizes complementarity between trees and grain crops, vegetable crops, forage crops, livestock that are in the same system. Agroforestry brings functional diversity onto the landscape. It brings perennials onto the landscape, produces a whole lot more in terms of agro-ecosystem services than just climate solutions, but certainly climate is an important piece here. Agroforestry is a mitigation solution in that there are opportunities to sequester a substantial amount of carbon, getting it out of the atmosphere where it's a problem and into biomass and soil where it's a solution, and opportunities to reduce trace gas emissions. And Nate Lawrence, our ecosystem scientist, is going to talk about that. But agroforestry is also an adaptation solution, and I'm going to set that up a little, and then I'll turn it over to our landscape ecologist, Monica Shea, to talk about work that we're doing. So of course, the adaptation challenge here with climate change is that wherever you're farming now, it's going to move, so to speak. Illinois, for example, will be more like a Mississippi climate, even more like an Oklahoma climate over time, we fear. And how do we get ready for average changes and variability? Agroforestry, of course, is partially already a solution. It buffers these other systems against those shocks. Trees are not shrinking violets. They have a lot of adaptive potential already, but they're also not invincible and will be challenged by these climate shifts. And so this transitions here to my colleague Monica, who will share one of our key efforts to get ready for that.
Thanks, Fred. So yes, one project that we're currently working on to address climate adaptation is mapping the suitability of various trees across the Midwest. And that's looking at both future and current climate scenarios. And by creating these maps, we hope to see how suitability for different species might shift and change over time. And that can better inform agroforestry planning. So a question that we're often asked is, what species can I grow on my farm? This is a very important question to ask in the early stages of agroforestry planning, and it can ultimately affect whether or not agroforestry is successfully adopted. And included in this thinking is thinking about how species are suited for both current and future climates, because the species, a lot of them that we're considering planting, are really long-lived. And so to address these questions, next slide, please. We are very interested in learning and documenting and sharing where these different species can grow. These different tree and shrub species that people include in agroforestry settings. And we're particularly interested in where they can grow on ag land. And one of the great things about agroforestry is that it's very flexible, and there are many different species that farmers can choose from, but that also makes it really challenging in the planning stage to sort of narrow down which trees they might be able to plant on their land. And it's especially challenging for some emerging crops where there's fewer resources available. And so our goal is to, can you go to the next slide, please? Help produce these suitability maps to help make that information more available to people. And so, sorry, I lost my spot. So many people have created suitability maps for specific species or in specific locations. But our goal, that can be helpful for people that are looking at, specific species. But we want to help do this over broader areas. And so our goal in suitability mapping is to first create a consistent approach that's broadly applicable over large areas. And so can you go to the next slide, please? So we developed this systematic approach, and I'll just breeze right over it real quick. I won't go into too much detail. So to make these maps, we developed this approach. The first thing we do is gather all the information we can about the different environmental variables that affect a species' growth and productivity. And so this can be things like pH, soil drainage, growing degree days, chilling hours. And we compile all this information into a suitability criteria that's different variables that affect where and how a species can grow. We identify a range under which that condition is considered suitable. And if possible, we identify a narrower range under which the conditions are considered ideal. And then once we develop these criteria, we go through an expert review to make sure that everything makes sense and that it all looks good. Next slide, please. And so once we have the criteria finalized, we can put it through this software program that we created that's called Crop Targeter. And Crop Targeter is just a program in R that basically takes the suitability criteria, an area of interest, in this example, that's Sauk County in Wisconsin. And it goes through all of the different variables, relates it to environmental data that we have drawn in through the crop targeter system, and then creates a series of maps that shows for each of those variables whether or not the land is suitable or unsuitable or ideal for that condition. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to talk about each of these, but that's all the different variables that's on the suitability criteria list. And the different colors are different suitable versus ideal versus unsuitable. The gray is unsuitable areas. And then Crop Targeter takes all of these individual maps, plops them on top of each other, and summarizes them. So next slide, please. And this is sort of the final product, suitability map. So the white areas are the non-ag land. The gray areas are ag land that's unsuitable for, in this example, Chinese chestnut. And then the colored regions are areas that are suitable for chestnut and are colored by the degree to which that it's closest to ideal. So the closest to ideal is sort of the brightest colors, the orange and the yellows. Next slide, please. So we replicate this process and can create maps for really broad areas. So this is an example. It's currently a draft form, but for persimmon across the entire Midwest, or the 8 states that we're considering right now. And so the color scheme is the same. And this is under current climate conditions. And so our plan is to produce maps like this for at least 30 species we have data for already. This includes some really popular agroforestry species like chestnut, hazelnut, elderberry, currant, black locust, some other species that are used commonly for fruit and nut production like apples and pecans further south. Also timber species, as well as conservation specific species for windbreaks and riparian buffers. Next slide, please. And so those are currently in production for current climate. The next step is to consider future climate conditions. And so to do this, we are working with a group partners from the Illinois State Climatologist Office, as well as Appalachian State University. And as part of this project, we're basically downscaling some of the climate scenarios and producing some of the same agroclimatic variables that we have in our criteria, like growing degree days, precipitation, chilling hours. And then we're going to apply basically the same suitability mapping process using those climate projection data sets that we're creating. And so then we'll be able to see, this is the current suitability for persimmon. How does that change in future climate conditions? What geographies maybe are unlocked for persimmon, areas that we can't plant it now that might be suitable in the future? And then what areas might be lost, or what areas will productivity perhaps decrease? Both of those things are really important to consider. Next slide, please. And so, yeah, just reiterating what I was saying, both of these types of maps, the future and current climate suitability maps, will help us to identify the best places to plant certain species in order to maximize the adoption, production, and ultimately the carbon sequestration of these trees in agricultural lands. And that brings me to transitioning to Nate.
All right, thanks, Monica. Monica's shared how we're trying to help future-proof these systems, and then Nate'll chat about why adopting agroforestry now can help soften the landing here.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. Fred, you can go to the next slide, please. So I'd like to focus on, let's say we get these trees to survive and they are adapted to the landscape. How can they actually help kind of fight climate change? So starting with a 40,000-foot view of agriculture, we can see that the ag sector on the left pie chart is a significant portion of total US greenhouse gas emissions. And 11%, as it's displayed here, is taking a pretty narrow view of agriculture, kind of looking only at on-farm emissions. If we include all the transportation, industry, and commercial, emissions that are sort of part of the broadly defined food system, that number can be as high as a third of total emissions. So it's worth noting that currently agriculture is on the wrong side of the climate solution. It's in the climate problem part of the creating more emissions than it absorbs before we get too far into carbon sequestration. I also like to point out that the majority of those emissions, at least on-farm emissions, are from nitrous oxide, from nitrogen management in soils, and also from methane, from livestock manure management, and also from ruminant livestock like cattle directly. Next slide, please. So we've talked a lot about the adaptation of trees to climate. Trees can also help us not adapt to climate in ways like providing shade for livestock. So that's kind of a different definition of adaptation, but in the rest of this presentation, I'll be pretty narrowly focused on the mitigation side. So how can trees either reduce the actual impacts of climate change in the first place, reduce the causes of climate change by either absorbing greenhouse gases or reducing emissions? Next slide, please. So that kind of boils down to three different fluxes or pools that we want to measure. So trace gas emissions, as I mentioned, I'll focus a little bit on nitrous oxide because in the Midwest, that is a pretty big deal. Nitrous oxide is emitted at a huge rate from our annual cropping systems, and we want to get that down close to zero to get near kind of carbon neutral or climate neutral. And then we have these carbon sequestration pools that can take carbon out of the atmosphere and get us into the net cooling territory. And in agroforestry, we have enormous potential to store soil carbon in both soils and also in the biomass of the trees. Next slide, please. So this is showing that graphically. So on the y-axis on the left, we have tons of carbon equivalents per acre per year. And this allows us to compare trace gas emissions to carbon sequestration in kind of an apples to apples warming versus cooling impact. So on the left box plot here, we have a, let's say, traditional or typical conventionally managed corn soy system and what we might do in that corn soy system in the Midwest to reduce emissions through no-till or adopting cover crops. And we can see, this is the final time I'll stress this, that nitrous oxide emissions from these systems are extremely high. The US Corn Belt is kind of ground zero for US nitrous oxide emissions. So that puts us with a big source of emissions that even with some soil carbon gain, perhaps from no-till or adopting cover crops, we're unlikely to get into the net cooling total impact. We're still producing more emissions than we're likely to absorb. So agroforestry has enormous impact, first in reducing nitrous oxide emissions, either by using nitrogen inputs more efficiently or by reducing the need for nitrogen inputs to begin with. So you're kind of closer to zero. And then through building soil carbon, perenniality or adopting perennial crops is typically associated with some of the highest soil carbon gains of our ag practices. So we have kind of all of the soil carbon gains that we might see in annual cropping systems. And then the really big impact is the woody biomass of the trees themselves. So wood is about 50% carbon by dry mass. And the amount that could be captured per acre per year depends a lot on the age of the planting, on the trees that were planted. That was covered a little bit in the Minnesota talk, and you saw how fast some trees grow compared to others. But it can vary from a similar magnitude to the soil carbon all the way to like -1 or -2, which would be way off the bottom of this slide. So way into the net cooling impact. Next slide, please. But the vast majority of this research is done at a small handful of locations, usually partnered with land grant institutions, and often where there are USDA ARS labs that are notified here. I think this is challenging because we don't always see the same results across these different very heavily studied field sites. So next slide. I think we need to move towards having a lot more of these measurements of trace gas emissions, carbon sequestration, both in soils and biomass across the landscape. And what we'd like to do is kind of facilitate a much larger network of collaborators that are measuring those things in basically any natural climate solution. Doesn't have to be agroforestry, although that's the one that we're most narrowly focused on, but it could be perenniality, it could be anything that we think is going to have a positive climate impact in agriculture, and then making sure that we're measuring that in ways that are both feasible to do for varying levels of interest. Depending on how much you want to do, you can still measure something and measure that impact. And then also we're measuring in ways that we can compare across and between these sites so that we're actually able to quantify the ecosystem impact, the climate mitigation impact on a regional scale, and hopefully use that to leverage more of these plantings, as well as to show that they're having the impact that we want and think that they're going to have. And with that, I will hand it back to you, Fred.
Thank you, Nate. I think in the interest of time here, I am just going to abbreviate the last couple things here and sort of the synthesis statement here. So you've seen these kind of two vignettes of agroforestry mitigation and adaptation research. I think at this point in trying to work the transformations needed to reverse climate change and deal with its locked-in impacts, I think we need to generalize. Number one, we need to be transitioning from doing science that is based only on making the case that biodiversity and perenniality are qualitatively better than a lot of existing systems, and advancing to doing science that helps actually implement these alternatives without, trying to fully digest this conceptual model here. The red bar is what can be influenced by making the case that one thing is better than another. The rest of these stacked components that are in this kind of model of what's going to motivate individual action, policy action, company action. How do we use research to quantify the benefits of systems like reforestation, like agroforestry over existing land use? And how do we use research to make these systems better and higher performing so that they'll have quicker uptake? And then how do we do this for real in big networks rather than in unproductive isolation here? And so I think I'll leave it with there. I think we have a couple minutes for Q&A here, but I think our teams are ready to hang out a little longer. I'll leave it over to you, Josh.
So we already had one question and answered in the chat, but I'll just let you guys know. So someone asked, how difficult is it to find trees that are currently suitable for planting in a given region that will still be suitable in the future with climate change? And the answer that was given is that it really just depends on a smaller scale if the trees are going to be available locally within private nurseries. And also the prices, because different nurseries will have different pricing for the trees. And if you're looking for more operational and like a bigger farm and more trees, it's going to be a big limitation. There also was an article linked in the chat, so the recording will be posted. So if you are curious, you can always go back. If you have any questions here, I can come around, pass you the mic. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for the great presentation. On the last slide, last but one, what's 1, 2, 3, 4?
Yeah, so this is a conceptual model rather than data here. But these are different phases conceptually of agroforestry scale up, where we're sort of hypothesizing, well, in this we know for sure, the earliest adopters are people who are driven significantly by non-financial motivations. They usually want to break even in their farming system at least. We can do that for them now, but the hypothesis here is that the next phases of scaling of agroforestry systems will necessarily need need to involve people whose non-financial motivations are somewhat smaller, that red bar. And so we need to be ready to make these systems work, through some combination of economic performance, public incentives, and then perhaps private ecosystem services markets.
Great. So that following up on that, my question is that my understanding is that, even with cover crops, it's been so difficult to make producers adopt them. And this is great. We all agree on this. So in your work in this area, what kind of, chatter is happening on the producer side of things? Because they don't even want to do cover crops. And this is like out there, this is like wild, wild west for them. So what do you, in your experience, how long will 4 take?
Yeah. 4 will take a long time. I think we shouldn't mistake that. Getting to 1 and 2, getting to the first phases of scale up, and this is a key part of our theory of change, that there's a nonlinear effect of seeing something in action on the ground almost at any scale that has in legitimizing more resources being allocated to put the prerequisites in place for the next phase of scale up. So to take this example, this orange bar here is production revenue. For an agroforestry system, that's based on number one, having excellent harvestable tree crops, fruit and nut trees, for example, that are high yielding, having production practices to successfully grow them. Number two, it's based on knowing what agroforestry systems design practices will maximize the yields of the other crops and the livestock that are there. Right. And so how do we get the research going that's needed to fully refine that knowledge and those plant genetics? And how do we get the kind of the boundary work going that'll translate that into actual action? And so the hypothesis is, let's put this to work everywhere that farmers are ready to adopt it, even if those numbers are low in the aggregate, and then use that to help legitimize bringing the system components to a place where they'll be more appealing to more people and get into kind of a virtuous cycle that way.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
I think this is really just a follow-up to exactly what was being asked now. To what extent is blue happening, and what can interested parties do to push on government or private industry for more blue? Yeah,
so great question. So the climate mitigation part here, fairly minimal happening now. There have been over the last 10 years, there's an early wave of attempts to start private carbon payment programs. I think to say that they didn't get traction would be a generous interpretation. And then there's certainly a lot of commercial and governmental activity. Now, I think the best thing, so I'm personally am uninterested in scenarios where something succeeds commercially, but it succeeds based on tokenism or based on kind of lowest common denominator science, and is basically getting payments to flow, but only to practices that have marginal benefits here. And so one thing that we can do in every sector of the economy, every sort of field, is really push for an outcomes-based paradigm for these payment programs, whether it's private markets or government incentives, so that it's based not on qualitative factors like we deem that no-till and cover crops and C, D, and E are good. Other things are not on the list. We're going to pay out qualitatively for these systems. Instead, we want these things need to pay out based on actual climate mitigation performance as determined by sound and rigorous science. And so advocating for that outcomes-based paradigm and then putting the legs under the science to be able to really implement it, I think are the prerequisites there. Where trees are particularly exciting, I've worked most of my career in every part of agriculture other than trees. And what excites me about trees is that woody biomass is really easy and uncontroversial to measure relative to soil carbon. And so as we're honing our societal skill set on soil carbon, how do we foreground this readily measurable and kind of demonstrably high impact from a quantitative standpoint thing, and design payments programs to reward it.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us. If you have any more questions, I think that some of our speakers might be interested in answering afterwards.
How long is the session?
10.
Oh, okay. Well.
So yeah, and we discussed beforehand, we're going to continue to hang out. So I don't know if you want to we can dismiss anybody who wants to go.
Yeah, I mean, I know I have so many questions, so I'm going to be staying around. If you go back towards the Frick Forum, there will be some light refreshments, and then at 10:30, our next session of workshops will begin. The recording, this has been recorded and will be available on the WHO app for 3 months or so. So feel free to watch that. And thank you guys so much.